Hello, I'm Gautam Paul from NZ Blockchain Forums, and welcome to episode 5 of Blockchain Bytes. Today, we are going to be speaking with Deborah Crowe. Deborah is a co-founder of Usedfully, whose mission is to decarbonise the textile sector. Deborah, I don't want to sort of introduce everyone. I'd rather you told us more about yourself. So please, if you could just sort of elaborate on yourself.
Oh, thank you. And thanks for having me here today. It's really quite an honour and a pleasure. So my background has been quite varied. I grew up on a farm in Southland, had a very, intrinsic love for the environment right from an early age. And when I was at school, I actually really loved sewing and making my own clothes and that sort of thing. And I really did want to follow a path down that area. However, I was at a pretty traditional school. It was an all-girls school, and I guess we were encouraged to do something a little more than just, make clothes. And I had a very strong mathematical brain, and I ended up pursuing an engineering degree because actually I wanted to be an astronaut. That's actually what I really wanted to do as well. So astronauts were either pilots or engineers. However, it was also around the same time that New Zealand and America had a bit of a falling out, and over the whole nuclear thing. And so the reality of actually New Zealander becoming an astronaut under the US regime just wasn't going to happen. And then anyway, so I finished my engineering degree, started working with what was telecom back then, that's now Spark. In my mid-20s, I went off and did my OE, as we do, found myself in America anyway, did actually happen to meet a real-life astronaut, so that was one of the highlights of my visit. But while I was there, I also had the opportunity to do a nature retreat with a teacher called John P. Milton. And that really spoke to me on so many levels. And out the other side of that, I was talking to him about, heading back to New Zealand, what was I going to be doing? And as he understood my, interest in my background in engineering and my interest in business, he encouraged me to look at the works of Paul Hawkins, I think it is, who's now written Drawdown, but at the time it was The Ecology of Commerce. And so this is going back 30 years, but I was really intrigued by what we now call, the circular economy, as far as taking the waste out of one business and using it as an input into the next business. And he was talking about that, really succinctly back in the 90s. So I came back to New Zealand, went back to my engineering. That forged a pathway into technology and software development. And that was where my entrepreneurial, endeavours began. But I got to my early 30s, had my midlife crisis a little early, and went, is this really what I want to be doing? And I went and did a graduate diploma in fashion and textiles and the whole material science. And I really did that just because I wanted to. And then realised quite quickly that I probably wasn't destined to be the next best fashion designer and winning great awards. And by that stage, I started a co-founded with some other guys called Run the Red, and we were doing mobile messaging, SMS messaging, back in the early 2000s. So that sort of led to basically the next 15 years really being involved in technology. And I realised that I just do have a love for the emergent and what's sort of new and those shiny toys. But most importantly, I'm interested in how do we apply them to our real world situations, and how do we actually, as I've got older and the issues that we've got in our world now, and you're looking at, our climate change issues and all of the sorts of things that are making us focus on how do we really apply technology for the health and well-being of our planet. That's really what's then brought me to the loop of now combining, my engineering, my love of textiles, and my love of the environment into Usedfully, which is now around the decarbonisation of textiles and looking at how technology actually supports that. So, and somewhere along the line, I got introduced, my curiosity led me down the path of blockchain. I've been involved in that in a sort of applied way since about 2016. So I was fortunate enough to go to one of those conferences, I think that Mark Pascal organised. And really got quite interested in that. But actually, what were the social factors that need to be present in order for that technology to work? And so things like trust really began to get interesting for me in ways that they hadn't before.
Oh, thank you, Deborah. Thank you for the intro. And actually, that leads perfectly into the first question I wanted to ask you about trust. Why do you think the conversation around trust has changed in recent years? And what does it look like now?
It's a really interesting question. And about 3 years ago, I was at a conference in Denmark, and I was asked to speak in a panel there on trust and blockchain. And at that time, what I was loving, I guess, was the whole aspects of blockchain in terms of the immutability and the validation of things, and that you could, be proving a particular event or activity, from anywhere in the world. So, I love the idea of removing the borders, and that it was now decentralized, and all of these qualities of it. But one of the big tenets was, well, now you don't need a third party to verify trust. And so at that time, what was great was it was actually bringing the conversation of trust to the table, and to businesses in ways that it had never been before, or certainly I'd never really witnessed it. So just the mere fact that the presence of this new emerging technology and what it was claiming it could do, it was actually opening up conversation that I think was fundamentally important. And that was one of the things that I really loved about it. Fast forward to where I am now, and having spent the last 2 years really immersed in the textile industry, which is by its very nature extremely complex. And when you look at the supply chains and the multiple parties that are involved, the issue of trust is really quite interesting when you get into a genuinely complex environment. So it's one thing to be able to have a trust equation when you've got a reasonably small ecosystem. So let's say, it's always difficult once you've got more than 2 parties, but when you've got, say, 6 to 10 parties, I think it's great to then be able to prove at each handoff point, yes, I've done what I say I'm going to do. When you're actually in an industry where there might be, 50 touch points along the supply chain, it actually becomes even more difficult. And collaboration is all very well, and we talk about it, but it's actually quite difficult to do in practice. And unless there's some unified reason that you're all aligned with, like a mission that you're naturally aligned with and you're going to naturally prioritize, it can be quite difficult to achieve. But I think that, and what we're witnessing right now with, say, the global pandemic, is people are now seeing almost a lot of the businesses that we're working with are they're just trying to survive. So they don't actually have a lot of extra capacity for collaboration. But that's where I get curious then. I sort of think, okay, well, if something like we could actually make really applied use of, say, blockchain technology, where we've done the work to identify what are those key points along the supply chain that are really important in terms of there's a sense of as the next party in the supply chain, I don't need to question what they've said, like there is some degree of assurance there, then it might, help us take some of that effort out of it, might pave the way for those things being easier.
Okay. And how does your particular interest in the textile sector play into the circular economy? And what role do you think new technologies have to play in all this?
So one of the key emphasis of Usedfully, as you said at the beginning, is looking at the decarbonisation of the textile sector. So there's 2 key ends to that, right? There's the production end, and there's a lot of efforts already being done in that side of the industry. And blockchain has already been applied in quite a few situations to actually track the provenance of where those raw materials come from, where are they being ginned, where are they being spun, where's the clothing being manufactured, and then within that, people are able to use the smart contracts to actually say validate that there's certain working conditions, or they've received a particular stamp of certification, for example. So there's a lot happening on that end of it. The end that hasn't been well understood is the impact of textiles once they're past that first intended use, and that most of them end up in landfill. So when they end up in landfill, they, there's the carbon emissions that we have to think about. And just the other thing, though, is that it's such a waste of really usable resource.
Yeah.
Right? So our work is really focused more at that end of things. And what we're also realizing is that when people talk about circular systems, and while on one hand the idea of circularity is as ancient as our indigenous customs, in our modern world it's become a little like, what's the circle, whereas in reality it's more like a spiral. And when you look to nature is more like a spiral. It's like the tree, the leaves fall from the tree and they go down and they create nutrients for the earth. They don't grow into another tree. The seedling might, for sure, but the leaves don't. But what they do is they go on to support the next piece of life.
Yeah.
And so I think when we're talking about our end of use and our decarbonisation, we have to think about what's the next best local life. So as we think of that, it's like, well, what are the key points, data points, that are important to track along that pathway? And that's where what I'm quite interested in, what we're beginning to apply our thinking to now is, okay, well, if you were going to use blockchain, for example, to help support the circularity of a sector, then, well, what are the things that you actually do want to know and that you do want to track? And now that you're getting a lot of stuff around claiming of carbon credits, for example, I think there's a great use case there to make sure you don't get double dipping on the claiming of carbon credits. The other thing that is really important when you're thinking about the production of any product, whether it's textiles or anything else, is what they call the life cycle analysis of each step along the way.
Yeah.
And also there's another thing that's becoming more spoken about, particularly in textiles, is the materials circularity index. So when you look at a circular economy, you're wanting to actually look at, well, what's the material impact as you take that material and flow it either back into another piece of textiles that you're going to make another garment into, or if that's not practical, into a raw material that might be a product into another industry. So what a lot of people don't realize is polyester is PET. So there's a lot of rPET available with all that polyester that's currently going to landfill.
Oh, right.
Yeah, but if the logistics of shipping it and the energy required to processing it exceeds the emissions going to landfill, then you've got to look at, well, what's the balance of that equation? But if you could, let's say that was neutral, the fact that you might be then meaning that you're not having to import more rPET into New Zealand, and you think of all the shipping costs that we've got going on, and there may be still advantage in the fact that you're reducing the draw on virgin resources. So that's the other area that we see is really important from circularity. How do we reduce the draw on our existing virgin resources?
And as people think of new technologies, what are some of the useful considerations they should take into account so that they ensure they're effective and not simply a gimmick?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Dear to my heart, that one. It can be, for those who are, I guess, at the front end of the curve, we need those people who just want to play with technology and do the gimmicky things, right? Like, that's really important. And I think we've seen a lot of that with blockchain, and certainly even by the time I came to the table, back in say 2016, 17, there had already been a few sort of gimmicky things done, and then there were let's say quite a few more gimmicky things done, and then it began to mature in terms of what it can do and what it kind of can't do and what it's good for, and we began to better understand things like the energy that it takes to serve a blockchain, and then new protocols have come out of that are more energy efficient. So the technology itself has come a long way, and there's still a lot to do, but I think the understanding of it is now so much greater than what it has been. So now we're in a situation where we can actually look at it and go, well, how can we use it in a way that really makes it worthwhile using? And it doesn't really matter what the technology is. That's going to come down to how well we can actually articulate the problem that we're going to solve, how well we can define the processes that are needed to then solve that problem. And because essentially then what we're doing is codifying those processes. So if we've got poorly defined processes, it can be the most beautiful blockchain in the world, but it's still not going to be a great outcome.
Yeah.
And that takes effort, and it can take asking some hard questions, I suppose, in terms of but I think it comes down to, if you're going to embed a particular action or a data, you're putting that stamp on it that this actually happened, and I want to be able to verify it, and I want the next person in the chain to really trust it. You do have to ask yourself, what's the purpose of it? Like, what is it? Why does it matter? And there are plenty of things that do matter, but let's encode for them, because every transaction you do, there's a gas cost, etc. And there's a lot of other information that's useful supporting information. But if it only needs to be known within your silo, within your organization, it probably can just be retained in a traditional database. I think it's more when it then needs to be passed on to someone else, then it makes sense to use it. So it really comes down to getting clear and putting that effort in as to, well, why do you need it? And that's not changed. That's been the same for the whole 30 years of technology that I've been involved in.
Okay. Where does the environment fit into this conversation? And how can technologies like blockchain tie in, to help us better understand and track ethical and environmental factors?
Yeah, that's another great question for me. Look, I think, you might like to, the environment, right? Big amorphous thing. But the thing is about the environment is it's by nature, it is borderless.
Yeah.
And one way you might say, oh, but New Zealand's got a natural border, it's got its land mass, it's clearly defined, and it's got the ocean that surrounds it. Well, yes and no, because the thing is, the rivers flow into the ocean, and the ocean has trade currents that go everywhere else.
Yeah.
Right. And so the waste that we put into the ocean from our country, it doesn't necessarily just stick to our coastline. And the same with waste that comes from other places. And so when it comes to textiles, microfibers from textiles are one of the biggest causes of our ocean plastic pollution. And the issue with them is you can't even see them. So, by its nature, our environment is borderless, or it has natural borders, like it has natural catchment areas. So how can we use something like blockchain to capture that? The sorts of things I get interested in is, if I was looking at the blockchain, say, of a particular product or a textile, I would actually like to see that it actually came from as close to me as possible, like that it was as, say, locally sourced as possible. Or that if it had been imported, that we can understand, well, what was the cost to get that here? In terms of the environmental impact, the water utilisation, the transport and logistics, the power utilisation at the factories, the worker conditions. So all of those things, if we can understand them better, and we've got in mind what is the lightest footprint we can have on the earth, that's where I think those things can really help. So for me, it's not simply about the tracking of it, the journey of it. I mean, that's all very interesting, but what I'd like to see overlaid with it is then, okay, well, what was the true environmental cost or human cost, social cost of importing that product? And did we really need to?
I know. I read quite a distressing article recently about nurdles and how these nurdles they're in fish, they're all around, and these are off the microfibers and the little plastic pellets that we are, because we're demanding cheaper and cheaper products. Then more and more, throughout everything we buy and we purchase, it's appalling.
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, this is more than the sort of the economics of it, but if we could have like token representation, for example, of that garment is the equivalent in weight of 2 penguins in terms of its carbon emissions, and it's actually a spa pool worth of water that went into creating it, like using tokens in a way to go, well, how do we actually trade those? But you're creating tokens that are analogous to the impact. And then actually, well, do you want to trade these tokens, and how might you do that? So those are the sorts of things that I love to get curious about and kind of like what ifs. So that's back at, you might say, at the gimmick end of things. But how do we make these things more tangible? So maybe you're buying that shirt off the rack behind me, but when you look it up, you also then go and buy the token that is the relative cost of what the additional cost or the true environmental cost of what it took to produce that. Because unfortunately our finance system and our commerce system hasn't encoded all these externalities. So that's where I get curious. I'm like, can we use this to begin to encode those externalities and make them more visible?
Oh, thank you so much, Deborah. Last question I've got for you. If you had one important message for the next generation around technology and the environment, what would it be?
The thing is that, and I said this in one of my earlier pieces a few years ago, is that in order to protect something, you have to truly know it, and really love it and really have that connection with it. And so, for anyone really, the stronger and deeper their connection and the love for the environment and the planet is, then the more likely they will use technology and their knowledge of it and their love of technology in service to the environment. So the first thing really is fall in love with the planet, fall in love with the environment, fall in love with your backyard, your trees, your rivers, whatever it might be. And then think, okay, now that I'm really excellent with my application of technology, how could I use that to help that I love?
Deborah, thank you so much for your insights. And I am going to be delighted to actually be able to stand in front of you at Trust, Traceability and Digital Trade on the 28th of February next year. So delightful to speak to you, and all the best.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the time today. Take care.